there is a place on this path for cultivated improvements. You can systematically train things like flexible concentration, sensory clarity, a quality that we call technically equanimity, which is perhaps analogous to fluidity within a hydrodynamic system, roughly. So these are trainable skills, as I mentioned. So from one perspective, we can take the reins and make improvements. From another perspective, there's nothing to improve. It's early processing. I'm guessing that what the mystics of the world call the taste of now is related to what, as neuroscientists, we would call early processing, those first 100 or 500 or maybe even a few thousand milliseconds as visual, auditory perception, inner and outer, arises, as thought, speech, action on the expression gates, as that arises. At that moment of arising, there is, in each moment, no matter what the content of that experience is, there is an original okayness that's there. And it's not cultivatable. You don't need to cultivate it. It's already taken care of it. It's already taken care of it. So around the world, how to deal with this, how to deal with the fact that, in a sense, seeking is the problem. You're already there. On the other hand, look at the wretched parade of human history, how we're screwing ourselves. We're clearly not there. Something's wrong here, and we need to do something about it. So how this is dealt with around the world is mature or immature. And when it's immature, it leads to philosophical and even political conflict. When it's mature, it's good. Once again, my personal opinion. So what is this? So in Zen, for example, just to give a specific lineage, Chan, Zen, Chinese practice influenced by Indian Mahayana Buddhism. So in Zen, there's two schools of Zen, Soto Zen and Rinzai Zen. Soto Zen says you don't meditate to cultivate any focus factors. You don't meditate. You do sit a lot, but you just sit to express your faith in the primordial okayness of each moment. Rinzai Zen is different. They say you're deluded now, and after you've passed 1,750 koans, you will not be deluded, and we'll get you to that. It'll take about 20 years in a monastery. Pretty rough training. And then you'll be there. So original enlightenment versus cultivated enlightenment. They argued about this in the Buddhist tradition. I'll have to say from my own experience, there's a place for both. There, you can definitely improve your focus factors through systematic training, just like you train a muscle. There's nothing all that strange about that. So in the West, this comes out as the division between Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholic Christianity first. They divided on this. To what extent are these mystical experiences something you cultivate and you can get there? To what extent is it the exact opposite of that? You have to give up the fact that you're going to do anything. Passive contemplation, let God do it to you. So there's a very subtle distinction in Eastern Orthodox Catholicism versus Roman Catholic, arguing about the percentages caused a division within Christianity that was pretty vicious. The same argument comes up again with Protestantism. Luther was a failed meditator. He tried to meditate. It's hard. He couldn't do it. And he decided the problem is we can't do it. We can't practice. We can't do anything. Sola fide, sola gratia. It's all faith, and the faith itself is given by God. You don't merit it. So it's what broke the Roman Catholic from the Protestant, and then the Protestants also somewhat. So my perspective on this is that it's a little bit analogous to, is light a wave or a particle? There was vicious scientific debate for several centuries. It wasn't nice about this. Now we just accept the fact. You can look at it as wave, you can look at it as particle. That's a good thing, because sometimes one perspective, engineering-wise, is better. So I would say that broadly, all over the world, the mystics have to deal with this paradox that you can make cultivated improvements, but in the end, it's not about you.
I think part of the paradox is self-created. There is one big practice that we forget when we start looking for other practices, like the 1500 koans. We forget that life itself presents us with 15 billion koans. That life itself is a koan. Because life is hard, we avoid doing the one thing that this whole thing is probably about, which is to pay attention to life, even or especially when it's hard, and to distract ourselves from the reality of life to some extent. And I know I'm choosing things to say that that go against the notion of a spiritual practice, because it's nice to have a discussion emerge from the seeming contradictions between us, but you shouldn't interpret that as my thinking that spiritual practice has no place. I actually think very actively that it does have a place, and I think it's one of the greatest losses in Western culture that we abandon spiritual practice. But it should not be engaged in as a distraction away from the practice of life, which is what we try to do with spirituality. Has become escapism. It's a way to escape the suffering of life because we all want to stop suffering. And in surrendering to that instinctive desire to stop suffering, which is legitimate, it doesn't feel good, so we want to stop suffering. But in surrendering to it, we miss out on the upside of suffering. We miss out on life. Because what is life about? Life is about maturing, growing up, becoming an adult. But we live in an adolescent society that is desperately seeking distractions away from the very things that could mature us, if only we would pay attention. So I think the paradox can be resolved by the practice of paying attention, which is not a separate practice from life. It's not a way to try to wrestle control of life. It's an attentive observation of life in and out. Because, you know, life does the trick. It has an uncanny ability to be a teacher. It's unbelievable sometimes how life comes to you and puts in front of you exactly that thing that you need, but you're most afraid of. It's like you pray to God, anything except that. And guess what? There's a knock at the door, and it is that. It's the very thing that comes around. Um, and then instead of paying attention to what then follows, we go do spiritual practice. And that is the great tragedy, I think.
I think I would not be comfortable characterizing spiritual practice as escapism only. If you take a look at what we call the life practice program, it's on the internet, it's all archived. You'll see what you're saying is what we do. You could call it whatever you want. The only difference is we do it systematically. Somehow you were lucky enough that you got it without that systematic. But I don't remember the exact words you said. Something about being nature's slave and what, but then there was the other part. What was the other part? There was being nature's slave. And then you said, but at the same time, Bernardo, what were your words? Because it was quite moving.
It's the profound freedom entailed by the acceptance of being the slave of nature.
Yes, the freedom that comes from accepting being the slave of nature. So Spinoza famously said, Deus sive natura. Call it God, call it nature, I don't care. It's the same thing for me. He said that in Latin. That was very shocking to the Western world. I will have to say, in Chinese, the word for nature is tian, and the word for God is tian. It's the same characters. You can't even say, call it God or call it nature, because from that culture, it's the same thing to begin with. West, not so much. Anyway, you could also say it's being God's slave, in a sense, if you wanted to. And I would actually be comfortable with that and still say that I am a rigorous, logic-based person, an evidence-based person. You call it being nature's slave. My poetry is you're God's slave. You're right about the Christian thing. It's not contradictory to science. It's evolutionary. It's, but that's another discussion. So the freedom that comes when you realize you are nature's slave. That was the phrase. Wow. I'm saying I do systematic practice. If a student came to me with that, I would say that's the insight function speaking. It's very, that's amazing.